I realized at some point, you know how sometimes you're having a discussion and you get defensive, right? Someone says something that you see as maybe an insult or an attack or even just a jab, right? Even just a slight jab, and you immediately start to defend your position. And at some point I realized, like, you know what? I think that's never useful. I think it's never the right way to communicate is to be on the defensive like that. And so I started paying attention to that and trying to, it's basically one of the things I try to never be defensive, right? And it's a similar thing, right? Where if you allow that to happen, if you interpret something as, oh, this is, you take it personally in some way, right? You take it personally in some way, you rush to the defense, and it basically never works. It's usually then you're defensive, the other person gets defensive, and then it usually escalates from there. And if you can just observe, like I say, if you first observe, like, oh, that hurts, and then, hold on, why is that? And then, because if you think about it, there's always a better way to respond. Like you said, in retrospect, if you look back at that conversation, you can see that your defensiveness didn't actually serve whatever your goal was. Like you didn't convince anyone with your defensiveness, right? You didn't win the argument. And so there's always a better way to respond. And sometimes it is exactly like you said, if you can just call out what happened, if you just like, listen, the thing you just said is like hurtful to me, you know, even if you just
can
start there.
engage from that point. So instead of post-observe, pre-observe, you know, that's the thing.
So how do you actually, is there an example? Is there like a specific example where you've applied this? And can you tell us more about, well, how to do that?
I've got one that happened like very recently, like yesterday morning. And this is just a sign that it doesn't always work out, but it's still working in my favor and improving my life. And it was very simple. Ryan and I were having a conversation, and he said something that I didn't like kind of sit well with me, and I went straight into defensive mode. And I said, but I can't, some kind of explanation about that. And he, like, we weren't angry at each other, but we didn't get anywhere in the conversation. So we just like, cool, okay. And we walked away, sat down at the computer, and I'm like, I just did it again. Went into defensive mode. And I thought about it, and I'm like, I actually want to know what Ryan had to say, because I blocked him. I didn't give him an opportunity to express himself because of some kind of internal conflict with myself. So I walked back to him and I said, Ryan, I got defensive there before we even got going. I actually do want to hear what you had to say. And then he told me, and we had this like great conversation. So that was me kind of doing it post-actively. I didn't catch it early enough. But by doing that repeatedly, like where you go back to the conversation and say, listen, I realized that I actually do want to engage with this. I should have said this earlier, but I'm saying it now.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because if you try to tell yourself, okay, I'm going to be like, now I'm going to have this Zen master attitude from now on, you know, it's probably not going to work out, right? Because you have to practice this kind of thing. It's like everything is a habit, everything is a skill as well. So being able to observe what's happening and then react, it's a skill. You have to, you know, if you've just had this idea now, or this is the first time you've heard of it, it's like, well, you have zero practice in doing this right now. And so in the beginning, you won't be good at it. And you have to give yourself the opportunity to practice. And I think simply realizing that you can go back essentially. So even if you realize, oh, I failed at doing it just now, that doesn't mean like, oh, too bad, game over. Right? You can actually go back. And the more you do that, the more you'll be able to catch it earlier on. Right? It's like you're building that habit. In the beginning, there's a lag time, and you're closing that gap from when something triggers you or when something comes up, and the gap between that and your ability to catch it and be like, okay, I'm going to observe this first.
Exactly.
You're like closing that gap with practice.
And there was something in the book No More Mr. Nice Guy from Dr. Robert Glover that is very useful. He calls it the DEER approach, D-E-E-R. And basically D for defensive, E for explain, E for evade, and R for rationalize. So if you find yourself doing any of those in a conversation, you're probably engaging in some kind of behavior that you could do differently. So yeah, those in that moment with Ryan, I had like a mix of all of those four things, especially the rationalizing and explaining part, because that is the way I defend.
Yeah, totally. It also reminds me of like almost like the Socratic approach, where you ask questions. I think that's often really, really powerful because it's one of those things that is like much easier said than done, is seek to understand before seeking to be understood. And yeah, I think that's often a really useful way to communicate, is just keep asking questions until you're sure that you understand and that they understand that you understand. But it's the exact same thing, right? It's like that's something you have to practice. It's often very difficult to do that in the moment. But it is, in a way, the opposite of all of those things. It's the opposite of rationalizing and defending and so on. It's just being like, okay, I'm going to wait with my point, essentially. And I'm going to wait until I actually gain some understanding. An interesting thing about this is also, like, this works, but only in like a good faith setting, right? So if you're having a debate or something with someone who just wants to win, then this won't work, because they'll just exploit this, right? They'll just, the fact that you're giving them space and time to express themselves, they'll just exploit this to continuously do whatever. And I feel like that's, the nature of like internet debate has become that.
Exactly.
Where it's just like, oh, if you give me more time, if you ask me a question, I'm just going to use that to ridicule you and all this kind of stuff, right? Because it's only about scoring points. Like, who cares about whether it's right or wrong?
Yeah. It's interesting because we often try to fix things when they're most broken, but these things come up every day, and that's what's changing in my life by having seen it so repeatedly and starting to understand it for myself. It's like, as soon as you feel that slight discomfort, if you can just become aware of it, that's all it takes. Just like, just, you don't even have to fix it every time. Just become aware of it first. That's step number one. And everything we're talking about now is conversations.
Yeah.
So that's a good starting point. Like, whenever you're communicating with somebody, and like you said, don't let it be in a fight with somebody. Let it be in daily conversations with colleagues, with friends, like really everyday stuff.
Yeah, so it's also about observing the small instances of this, instead of only thinking about the big the big fight you had and trying to deconstruct that.
Like that example with Ryan, it was an insignificant conversation completely. We wouldn't even have thought twice about it, but because I've been so aware of this, it's like, there it is. And it's no effort on my part either.